Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I'm, while glad to hear the member for Blaxland ask some questions quite rationally as opposed to the member for Grayndler, I've spoken previously in this chamber about the Colombo Plan, and as somebody who was a student in Asia learning a language and somebody whose background as a practitioner is predominantly doing trade, living and working in Asia, the Foreign Minister's focus on economic diplomacy before taking on this role that she now fills, the delivery of the Colombo Plan is being received so well, not just here in Australia but indeed across particularly the Asia Pacific. I was disappointed in the member for Grayndler's very emotional beat up against the government, again unnecessarily. If I go back to the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd era, I then was based in Asia and I was doing deals and I had my head in spreadsheets. And when you're doing very large deals, often there is a cell for sovereign risk. There's a cell in a spreadsheet for sovereign risk, and that usually impacts a discounted cash flow in one way or another. At that time, Australia's sovereign risk was far higher than it was previously, and certainly far higher than it is now. And that is because the Australian economy was being managed so poorly by the previous Labor administrations. That had a detrimental impact on investment coming into Australia, but also Australia's reputation internationally. If there has been something in particular that this Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, and also his predecessor, has done so well at, it is executing on those free trade agreements. And indeed, the Korea, the Japan and China agreements all stalled under the previous Labor government, all stalled. And of course we saw the impact ultimately residing in the state of the national economy. Then, Deputy Speaker, look at our national economy, and indeed our national accounts only came out a couple of weeks ago, and what we see is unemployment at 5.4%. What we see is the first quarter of 2018, a growth rate of 1%, making annual growth 3.1%. We've got business confidence is up, investment is up. This is an extraordinary set of figures for Australia's national economy. And when you break down that last quarter of growth, the number one thing that drove Australia's growth for the first quarter, the biggest contribution to our GDP growth, was exports. Exports, Deputy Speaker. And so what we saw even in the last financial year, $374 billion in exports. Now that is a record for our country. In Queensland alone, Queensland total exports of goods valued at $70 billion in 2017. Now that's an increase of 25%. Of course, the biggest export good for us in Queensland is coal, followed by beef. Now there are nearly 25,000 people employed in that industry of coal in Queensland, nearly 20,000 in beef. Enormous producer of jobs and of growth to our economy. The track record of this government, as somebody who has worked in trade most of his life, I cannot tell you how proud I am to be part of a government that has concluded 7 FTAs. And to think of the FTAs that have impacted us, particularly in Queensland, the Japan, Korea and China FTAs, more recently Peru and the TPP-11, a negotiation, by the way, that the Leader of the Opposition thought we should fold on, all being delivered by this coalition government. That is what ultimately is opening up opportunities for us. And of course, negotiations now to start with the European Union. Now, this is a marketplace of 500 million consumers. This is a marketplace of a $1.7 trillion GDP economy. Again, we see opportunities opening up because we have the single most aggressive, ambitious trade agenda that this country has ever seen. Which leads me, of course, Deputy Speaker, to ask a question of our Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. And that is, if the Minister could expand on how the Turnbull government is delivering on our ambitious trade agenda, and how will that agenda continue to drive opportunities here in Australia, and particularly opportunities that will drive growth?